The wind cut across the plains like it had something to prove. Dust clung to everything: boots, skirts, rifle stocks, lungs. The kind of dust that didn't just settle on you but stayed. It worked its way into skin and memory, into reputation. Somewhere near the edge of the Black Hills in the spring of 1876, a woman rode alone, in that very dust. Her clothes didn't fit the rules. She wore men's boots, a battered hat pulled low, a rifle slung across her body like an extension of her spine. She moved with a kind of confidence that came from knowing that there was no one coming to save you, and there never had been. Her name, at least the one people knew, was Calamity Jane. To some, she was a folk hero. To others, a drunk, a liar, a menace. Stories followed her everywhere. That she killed men. That she drank harder than any of them. That she swore, fought, rode, and lived like someone who had already survived way too much to care what came next. But here's the thing about legends born in the American West. They don't come from comfort. They come from vengeance. They come from violence, loss, hunger, and a world where women were expected to disappear quietly or be punished for refusing to. Behind the tall tales and dime novels was a real woman navigating a brutal frontier with no safety net, with no protection, and with very little truth left intact by the people who told her story, even after she was gone. What did she actually do, though? What crimes were attributed to her? And which ones did she survive being blamed for simply not behaving, at least the way a woman should have at that time? And why does history still struggle to decide whether Calamity Jane was actually dangerous or simply inconvenient? Welcome to GBRLIFE Transmissions. I'm your host, Caitlin, and you're listening to GBRLIFE of Crimes, where we explore not just what happened in crimes committed by women, but why they happened and the psychology behind them. Today, we're stepping into the dust, the myth, and the reality of one of the most misunderstood women of the American frontier. This is the story of Calamity Jane. Martha Jane Canary was born on May 1st, 1852, in Princeton, Missouri. Though even this basic fact comes with caveats. Different sources list her birth year as anywhere from 1852 to 1856, and some accounts place her birth in Illinois instead of Missouri. This uncertainty isn't poetic license. It simply reflects the reality of frontier life. Records were sparse. Births went unregistered, and families moved so frequently that paper trails vanished into dust. What we do know with reasonable certainty is this: her parents were Robert and Charlotte Canary, and they were already struggling when Martha Jane was born. Her childhood was defined by instability so constant it became normal. The American frontier wasn't a backdrop. It was an active force in her life. The Canary family moved constantly, from Missouri to Montana, then to Wyoming, then back again. Historians who've done the most comprehensive research into Calamity Jane documented at least 6 major relocations before Martha Jane turned 14. Families like hers don't move because they want adventure. They move because survival demanded it, because food ran out, or jobs disappeared, or the worst part, illness would spread, or land failed, and every move meant starting over with less. Her mother, Charlotte, was pregnant repeatedly throughout Martha Jane's childhood. According to census records and family accounts, she bore at least 6 children between 1852 and 1866. Pregnancy and travel and sickness and poverty, it would wear down any woman's body, especially in a time like that. And in 1866, when Martha Jane was approximately 14 years old, the family attempted to cross the plains to Virginia City in Montana. It was a booming mining town where Robert Canary hoped to find work, but the journey was brutal, and it took months. And somewhere along the trail, Charlotte Canary fell ill, but she didn't recover. Charlotte died in Blackfoot, Montana, in the late summer or early fall of 1866. The exact date wasn't recorded, and there was no funeral announcement and no grave marker that survived. She simply vanished from historical record. One more woman claimed by the frontier. But this wasn't just a death, it was a lesson. On the frontier, women didn't get sick and recover. They got sick and they vanished. Martha Jane was now the oldest daughter in a family with multiple younger siblings, and a father who was by all accounts overwhelmed and struggling. And then it happened again. Robert Canary, left with children that he could not adequately provide for, started to deteriorate quickly. Contemporary accounts are thin, but what exists suggests heavy drinking and an inability to cope with the loss of his wife or the demands of single parenthood. And in 1867, less than a year after Charlotte's death, Robert Canary died in Salt Lake City, in Utah, which means there were two parents already gone in less than a year. There was no safety net and no grief counseling. There was no pause. This was the frontier. Martha Jane Canary was approximately 15 at this point, and at this point she was effectively orphaned. But she had younger siblings to care for and no support system, not within hundreds of miles. And this is where we need to slow down, because when a child loses both parents in rapid succession, especially in an environment that offers no stability, the nervous system doesn't just grieve. It reorganizes. Attachment becomes unsafe. Dependence becomes dangerous. Softness becomes liability. According to trauma psychology research, children who experience this level of loss and instability often develop what we now call hypervigilant survival response. The brain essentially recalibrates to assume danger is constant and protection is unavailable. Martha Jane learned this early. She wasn't taught that the world was cruel in theory. She experienced it directly, repeatedly, and without relief. So she adopted the only way she could. She became physically capable because, again, this was the frontier, and weakness attracted harm. She became loud because quiet children disappeared. She became self-reliant because relying on adults had already failed her twice. This is not rebellion. This is survival wiring. Shortly after her father's death, historical records placed Martha Jane in various frontier towns and mining camps: Piedmont, Wyoming, Fort Bridger, and later, Deadwood, South Dakota. She was working, surviving, moving between jobs that required physical endurance, cooking for work crews, hauling water, nursing during smallpox outbreaks, and yes, occasionally working in dance halls and saloons. As a young woman, well, still a teenager really, she began wearing men's clothing more frequently. Not exclusively at first, but often enough that it became part of how people recognized her. This wasn't a fashion statement. It was armor. Men's clothes meant mobility, durability, fewer questions, slightly more safety. It allowed her to move through the world without immediately being categorized as something fragile or available. She learned to ride because being left behind could mean death. She learned to shoot because being defenseless was not an option. She learned to curse because politeness never saved her mother. And here's the key psychological point most histories skip. Martha Jane didn't grow up choosing who she wanted to be. She grew up reacting to loss. By the time society encountered her, she was already shaped by trauma, grief, and prolonged instability. She didn't violate gender norms because she enjoyed shocking people. She violated them because the norms never protected her. And this is where the groundwork is laid for everything that follows. because when a woman grows up without protection, without attachment, and without permission to be vulnerable, the world often mistakes her coping mechanisms as moral failure. The frontier didn't just harden Martha. It stripped her of the option of being anything else. By 1875, Martha Jane was moving between frontier military posts, mining camps, and rough settlements across Wyoming and Dakota. She was in her early 20s and already known, not famous yet, but noticed. According to Captain Jack Crawford, a frontier scout and contemporary of Calamity Jane, who wrote about encounters with her in the 1870s, she worked as a teamster, driving oxen and mule teams, and occasionally served as a messenger for military units operating in hostile territory. He noticed that she rode harder than most, that she didn't wait for permission, that she showed up where women weren't expected to be, and she stayed where they weren't wanted. On the frontier, usefulness mattered, and Martha was useful. That's why she was noticed. Captain James Egan, who commanded troops in the mid-1870s, noted his military correspondence that a woman calling herself Calamity Jane had delivered messages between forts during periods of increased conflict with Native American tribes. He described her as reliable, but unconventional. At first, people talked about her skills. She could ride messages through dangerous territory. She could keep up with soldiers. She could survive conditions that broke others. But admiration on the frontier was fragile, especially when it came to women. So the tone shifted. The origin of the nickname Calamity Jane is disputed, with at least 3 competing stories, each telling us something different about how legends form. And this is when that tone shifted. In the first version, in her 1896 autobiography, really, a thin, highly embellished pamphlet written late in her life, likely to generate income, Martha claimed the name came from Captain Egan. She wrote that during the military campaign in 1872, or possibly 1873, she rescued Egan after he was shot, riding him to safety despite being under fire. According to her account, he recovered and told her, "I name you Calamity Jane, heroine of the plains." The problem here is that there's no military record of this incident. No contemporary newspaper coverage either. And there was no corroborating account from Egan or any other soldier. In other words, this story doesn't match any documented military action from that period. And then there's version 2 of how she got the name. Some contemporaries claimed that the name arose because misfortune seemed to follow her. If she arrived in a town, someone got sick. If she rode with a unit, someone got injured, or illness followed her. Fights broke out. Violence erupted nearby. And this version appears in multiple frontier newspaper accounts in the late 1870s and early 1880s, though always as gossip rather than documented fact. And then there's that version 3, where the name might have actually originated as just simple cruelty, a joke about her rough appearance, her drinking, and her refusal to conform. In frontier slang, calling something or someone calamity was a way of saying that they were a disaster, a problem, and something to avoid. What matters more than any of these versions is that the name stuck. And in 1876, the year Wild Bill Hickok was murdered in Deadwood, newspaper accounts from the Black Hills region were already referring to Calamity Jane as if it were her actual name. The Deadwood Black Hills pioneer mentioned her multiple times that summer, usually in the context of drinking and fighting and causing disturbances. But they mentioned her. And in August 2nd, 1876, they published how Calamity Jane has been somewhat obstreperous this week. And then in September of 1876, they stated that the woman known as Calamity Jane was removed from the Gem Theater for disorderly conduct. She wasn't Martha Jane anymore. She wasn't even Jane. She was Calamity Jane, the woman who showed up right before things went wrong. And that name followed her into towns before she did by this point. People had already heard of her before she arrived, and they expected recklessness, trouble, disorder. And when you expect something long enough, you start seeing it everywhere. If she drank, it was proof. If she argued, it was proof. If violence happened nearby, it was proof. The name didn't just describe her. It began to define her. And here's the quiet cruelty of it. Once people decided she was Calamity, nothing she did could undo that story. Neutral actions were reinterpreted. Survival instincts were reframed as aggression, and trauma responses became personality defects. The woman disappeared beneath the label. Martha Jane Canary became a walking omen, a character in other people's stories, and no longer the author of her own. And over time, the name began shaping her reality. Because when you're treated like disaster long enough, you stop trying to convince people otherwise. You lean into what's expected. You drink more. You fight harder. You stop correcting the record. There's a psychological phenomenon documented in criminology and sociology. It's called labeling theory. It was first articulated by sociologist Howard Becker in his 1963 work, Outsiders: Studies in the Sociology of Deviance. The theory is this: when society labels someone as deviant, that label becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The labeled person internalizes the identity. Their opportunities begin to narrow. Their social circles will shift. And eventually, they perform the role that they've been assigned because it's the only role available to them. Calamity Jane is a textbook case of this very thing. The frontier didn't just give her a name, it took away her real one. The one that she created because of safety, because of everything that happened to her. And once that happened, accusations became easier, violence became easier to attach to her, and myth became more believable than fact. By the time people started claiming Calamity Jane had killed men or lived lawlessly and had left destruction behind her, the groundwork was already laid. The name had done its job. And let's be clear about something. The frontier was violent by default. By 1870 and 1890, the American West experienced one of the highest homicide rates in U.S. history, reaching 64 to 116 homicides per 100,000 people annually. Compared to the rest of the United States, there was only about 5 per 100,000 people. Men killed in saloons, on trails, over cards, over land, over nothing at all. And most of it went unrecorded. Most of it went unquestioned. But when violence brushed up against Calamity Jane, it didn't fade into the background. It stuck. Stories claimed that she had killed multiple men, some saying self-defense, others saying cold blood. A few even painted her as reckless, drunken, firing shots without care for anyone who stood in her way. The problem is this: there is actually no evidence that Calamity Jane ever murdered anyone. Across multiple towns, the pattern is the same. Public drunkenness, disturbing the peace, fines paid, then she was released. No murder charges. No contemporary legal documentation tying Calamity Jane to any killing. What does exist are secondhand accounts, campfire stories, newspapers exaggerating, but written decades after the fact, or dime novels eager for scandal, and a public already primed to believe the worst. But there is one well-known story about Jane in 1877. The Cheyenne Daily Leader ran a story claiming Calamity Jane had shot a man in a saloon dispute. But when historians traced this account, there was no police report, no victim's name, and no follow-up coverage. The story appeared to have been recycled gossip, published as fictional stories. But for readers back in the East who had never been to the West, fiction became fact. And once the idea of violence attached itself to Calamity Jane, there was no longer need for any proof. Remember, she carried a gun, she drank heavily, and she fought back when threatened. That was enough. And in later years, during interviews conducted in the 1890s and early 1900s, several people who knew Calamity Jane were asked directly if they'd ever seen her kill anyone. Charles, or Buffalo Chip, a Deadwood resident, said, "I never saw her shot anybody. She talked big, but so did everyone." Or John McClintock, another contemporary, wrote in his memoir, "Calamity was rough, no question. But the stories about her being a killer, that's newspaper talk." Even Wild Bill noted that despite Calamity Jane's later claims of intimacy with Hickok, there was no evidence they were even close, and no evidence she was involved in any violent incidents during the summer of 1876, when Hickok was murdered. So why did the stories persist? Because nuance doesn't survive gossip. But over time, the accusations grew more dramatic. The details became darker, and the crimes more severe. And the more exaggerated the stories became, the more believable they sounded because they matched the character that people already thought they knew. And that is how myth replaces evidence. No one stopped to ask why so many violent stories followed her, but never reached a courtroom. No one questioned why men who committed confirmed killings, like Will Bill Hickok himself, shot a man named Davis Tutt in 1865, and he was acquitted of murder. He walked free and celebrated while her alleged crimes existed only in rumor. The answer here is uncomfortable. Calamity Jane didn't need to be guilty to be condemned. She just needed to be believable as a villain. And she was, because she didn't conform. By this point in her life, the accusations weren't just about crime. They were about control and reminding her and women like her what happens when you refuse to stay in lanes designed for you. So violence clung to her name whether it belonged there or not. And eventually the constant suspicion did something deeper. It isolated her. People didn't trust her. Employers hesitated to hire her. Communities kept their distance, and when someone is cut off long enough, survival strategies start changing. That's when drinking stops being social, when stories stop being playful, and when the lines between coping and collapse begin to blur. Calamity Jane wasn't remembered as a woman navigating the violent world and succeeding. She instead was remembered as the violence, failed by the men around her deciding that she was that violence as well, and telling others, including the newspaper, that she was the problem. And once that happens, the damage doesn't need a crime scene. By the 1890s, the frontier that had shaped Martha Jane Canary was beginning to disappear. The Homestead Act of 1862 had brought families west, and towns were starting to incorporate. Law enforcement, those chaotic mining camps and military outposts, were starting to be replaced by structured communities with clear expectations about respectability. Calamity Jane was now in her 40s, and she no longer fit in. The jobs became less steady. Military units moved on or disbanded. Towns that once tolerated her found her now embarrassing. The same traits that once allowed her to survive, toughness, bluntness, refusal to conform, became the very reasons to push her aside. And in 1887, she did something no one saw coming. She married Clinton Burke, a man described by contemporaries as a hack driver in El Paso, Texas. The marriage was brief and troubled, but they did have a daughter, possibly two, though records are unclear, but the relationship dissolved within a few years. Burke later told a reporter that living with Calamity Jane was impossible due to her drinking and inability to stay in one place. The drinking, which had always been present, shifted in purpose. It was social, but then it became relief, because she carried grief that was never named. Parents lost too young, children she couldn't care for, years of instability, constant rejection, a reputation she could never outrun, and beneath all of it, the quiet exhaustion of just having to be hard every single day just to exist. Alcohol softened that, It dulled the memory, it quieted shame, and it made the world less sharp. But it also gave people exactly what they expected to see. The more she drank, the easier it became to dismiss her. Employers saw liability. Communities saw a nuisance. Historians saw a stereotype and stopped digging. And in 1895, broke, ill, and desperate, Martha Jane wrote and published a brief autobiography. It was 14 pages long, cheaply printed, and sold for a few cents at train stations and county fairs where she appeared as a curiosity. The pamphlet, titled Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane, by herself. It's full of embellishments. The heroic rescue of Captain Egan, dramatic encounters with Native American warriors, romantic involvement with Wild Bill Hickok, but none of it can be verified. And this isn't evidence of pathological lying. It's evidence of desperation. She was selling the only thing she had left, the myth, the persona people wanted to see, because the real Martha Jane Canary was just traumatized and exhausted and aging. It wasn't marketable. Calamity Jane attached herself to the idea of belonging and tried deeply to fit in until 1903, where she was living in a small cabin in South Dakota, about 50 miles from Deadwood. She was 51 years old, but she fell ill, likely pneumonia complicated by years of alcohol abuse and malnutrition, and she was alone. And on August 1st, 1903, Calamity Jane died, and she was buried in Deadwoods next to Wild Bill, as she requested, who she called the love of her life. The gravesite became a tourist attraction almost immediately. But here's the final cruelty of her entire story. People came to see her grave, but not to mourn the woman, to photograph who they called a legend. And that's the cruel paradox of survival-based identity. When the world only recognizes you at your worst, improvement doesn't feel rewarding. Collapse becomes predictable, familiar. And by the end of her life, Calamity Jane was no longer a threat. She wasn't even dangerous, and definitely not violent. She was just worn down, poor, ill, and often homeless, but still reduced to a punchline. The frontier didn't kill her in a shootout. The law didn't catch up to her. She was undone slowly. And when she died, the myth lived on louder than the woman ever had. Psychologically, Martha Jane Canary shows us a familiar pattern, one that repeats again and again with women who survive trauma in hostile environments. Early abandonment, chronic instability, forced self-reliance, and no space for grief. These conditions don't produce neat outcomes, they produce adaptations. Toughness, vigilance, emotional numbing. That does work until it doesn't. And in reality, what she had? Complex PTSD. Because with complex PTSD, you typically have difficulty regulating emotions, distorted self-perception, difficulty maintaining relationships, hypervigilance and chronic stress responses, and substance use as emotional regulation. Jane had all of these. As her human self, Jane had all of these as her life became reduced down to a parody. So what crimes can we actually attribute to Calamity Jane? Drunkenness, disturbing the peace, and one documented instance of threatening someone with the pistols. But there were no shots fired, no injury, and charges were dropped. That's it. That's the woman behind the curtain. Everything else? The murders, the violent rampages, the lawlessness. It was rumor, gossip. It was fiction. But she was one thing. But one thing that wasn't fiction? Jane was a woman who refused to disappear quietly, who insisted on being seen, even when that meant being condemned. And she survived longer than she should have in a world designed to erase her. That's not crime. That is resistance. And that is something we should all remember her by. That's the legend of Calamity Jane. This has been GBRLIFE of Crimes, part of GBRLIFE Transmissions, and I'm Caitlin, reminding you that understanding the darkness helps us appreciate the light. Join me next time as we uncover another case that challenges everything we thought we knew about the criminal mind.